by all means. Oh, let me, sorry, I didn't even introduce my co-chairs, sorry. My name is Andrew Kolar. I co-chair this committee alongside Drake Jacobs and Tarika Leskew. And today we have former chair of this committee, Vernon Woodworth, as our speaker, and he will be talking about the 2021 Iecc and the Net Zero Energy Code. So with that, John, the floor is yours.
Sure. So good morning, all. I am going to give you a little bit of a update on what's happening, at least legislatively, or what's not happening legislatively or regulatorily in this new world that we find ourselves in. So for those that have been attending these meetings monthly, I usually provide a little bit of an update on things related to building codes or the construction industry. And we have a whole set of priorities at AIA Massachusetts that we look to try to enact. And sometimes we're successful at that, sometimes we're not. And now we find ourselves in a time where the world has been turned upside down. And much like I'm sure all of your worlds are a little bit of disarray right now, so is the legislature. They have a building that is set on a lot of traditions and a lot of constitutional requirements. And what we're finding now is that a lot of those traditions and constitutional requirements have run into the COVID-19 buzzsaw and are in a little bit of disarray at this point. So what we have is a House that has 160 members and a Senate that has 40 members. And the reality is those 200 members have not been able to figure out how to really effectively communicate with each other to try to do any of the business related to legislative actions. What they have been doing is meeting in what is called an informal, INFORMAL session, as opposed to formal sessions. And during informal sessions, each chamber will have generally 3 or 4 people in it. And what happens is whatever is brought up during those informal sessions, if it is to move, it is moved using a process called unanimous consent, which means everyone in the chamber has to agree on what is being presented, and it only takes one member to stop anything in its tracks. So while the legislature has been passing some bills as of late, you've probably seen that they extended permitting processes across the state. They've recently extended tax deadlines from April 15th to July 15th. They have given the Commissioner of Education the authority to cancel MCAS tests. So these were all pieces of legislation that were passed and signed by the governor. And normally those pieces of legislation would have been brought before all 200 members of the legislature for a vote. But because it was done in informal sessions, there were only 3 members in the House present and 2 or 3 members in the Senate present, and all of those bills were passed and sent to the governor. So the big concern is, well, that is effective for what we're doing with COVID-19. The real question becomes, what are we going to do on some of the bigger issues like transportation reform or housing or our state budget? And they still, quite frankly, have not figured out how they're going to handle that. The one thing we do know is that pretty much every legislative priority for us and for every other organization out there is pretty much dead in the water. The legislature is not focusing on anything other than COVID-19 at this point. They did start, I would say, to have a discussion yesterday around the idea of how to pass a state budget. And yesterday's conversation wasn't so much about the mechanics of trying to figure out how to pass a state budget, but around the mechanics of how to actually build a state budget. So traditionally, in December of every year, the House and the Senate and the administration get together for what's called consensus revenue hearings. where they bring in a whole panel of 5 or 6 economists who come in and talk about where they see the state's revenues going for the next year. And again, they usually do that in December. And then in January, the governor or the governor's office, the House and Senate will get together in early January, agree upon a consensus revenue estimate, meaning based on the economists will see an X percentage increase in revenue. The 3 branches will agree upon that and build their budgets around that, which they did do this year. But unfortunately with COVID-19, what we have found is that it's taken the revenue projections that they had made back in December and completely thrown them into the wind. So last week, the legislature tried to do another consensus revenue hearing, but then ran into massive technical difficulties in their live streaming ability. So they ended up canceling it and having it yesterday. And so they brought the economists in virtually and had the economists present their thoughts. And while there was a range, the reality was most of the range fell into the idea of saying that the fiscal 2021 budget, which would be enacted for July 1st, run from July 1st, 2020 through July 1st, 2021, is looking to have anywhere from a $4 to $6 billion shortfall in a $44 billion overall budget, and that our unemployment rate is projected to be somewhere around 18%. Now, what the economists were asked most about was whether the recovery would look like a V or a U or a W. A V meaning a very quick recovery, almost like you're turning on the light switch and we get back to where we were. A U, which would take a little bit of time and then at some point really kick in, or a W, meaning something like we turn the economy on too quick, we have a second round of COVID cases, and economy drops again and then tries to recover. The reality is the economists had no idea what recovery we might have, because all of them agreed that the only way that we're going to really be able to make any real predictions or projections about what our revenues might be is by following the science and figuring and sticking with our social distancing and waiting until we can find some sort of way to do contract tracing, and hopefully in 12 to 18 months have some sort of vaccination or cure, or call it whatever you will. But until that 18 months comes and until that cure comes, most of the economists have said it's a little bit like throwing darts. We just don't know where it's going to land, and it's hard to make projections. The state's immediate concern is that because we have extended our tax deadline from April 15th to July 15th, it will now mean that in the current fiscal year that we are in, the state will likely the state will be foregoing anywhere from $4 to $6 billion in revenue. And that will unfortunately cause an immediate shortfall in liquidity with the state, meaning there's not enough free cash in the state to keep it flowing for the next few months. So there was a long conversation with the state treasurer, Deb Goldberg, about doing some borrowing immediately to bring cash into the state so that the state can continue to pay its bills. Later on, there were some suggestions from legislative leaders to the House and Senate about ways in which to try to deal with getting a budget in place. The prevailing wisdom seems to be that we might have the legislature pass a series of what's called 1/12, basically monthly budgets. And the proposal right now is to pass a series of monthly budgets to get us through until after the November election. And then hopefully after the November election, things will have progressed, things will have gotten better, at least that's the hope, and that by then we might be able to actually convene the legislature all in the same room to actually take votes, recorded voice votes, and pass a budget that would be the remainder of the fiscal 2021 budget, basically from December through July. that is the proposal. We'll see whether that whether the House and Senate leadership take up that offer. The biggest problem that the legislature has right now, again, is that any bill that has money attached to it, like a budget, our state constitution requires that they have to actually be in chamber and actually vote using a recorded voice vote. And in the day of, or the era of COVID-19, the idea of trying to get the legislature together, or 200 members inside that building, and keep social distancing is a bit of a challenge. Again, they've been looking at the idea of remote using something like Zoom, but the problem is our state constitution, which was written somewhere in the early 1700s, never envisioned either the issue of COVID-19 or the concept of the ability for people to go online and actually see each other. So they are trying to work through that. But in terms of all our normal legislative priorities, climate change, building codes, things of that nature, interior design, they are all basically just on the back burner, along with every other piece of legislation that's out there. The only hints that we're getting are from the Speaker and the Senate President. The Senate President did indicate that she still feels as though transportation is something that's important, that needs to be addressed and could potentially come up for some discussion. The Speaker has noted that climate change and transportation reform are both something that he would love to see addressed. But again, they both heavily couched those comments by saying, we don't know how this session is going to play out. Our session technically ends on July 31st. So there is some discussions about extending the formal session past July 31st to try to address some other issues. But until they actually resolve the voting issue, extending sessions isn't really going to mean an awful lot. So unfortunately, that is kind of the update on the legislative front. Again, all things COVID-19 are at the front of the line. Pretty much everything else has been put on hold. On the regulatory side of the equation, it's much the same. The Board of Building Regulations and Standards met yesterday. They had one item on their agenda, which was dealing with the extension of CSL licenses, and they needed to bring that issue up because of some recent emergency orders put out by the governor that extended licensing licensing deadlines. So the board needed to get together to have a conversation about how to deal with licenses that were expiring now for construction supervisors. And that was the only topic. I did bring up a topic which will appear on their May agenda, which is an issue that the industry, meaning the design and construction industry, that has been having offline conversations. I'm sure you've all noticed that you are trying to figure out how to deal with your construction projects. I'm sure some of you have construction projects where the town has said, no, all permits are pulled and all construction is to cease. And some of you have projects in other towns where, regardless of the governor's order closing all construction other than schools, infrastructure work, or anything with a state permit, that cities and towns are deciding for themselves that they're still going to move forward with construction. And so we've been working with our counterparts in the engineering community, the contracting community, the owner side of the equation, and the building regulators themselves, to figure out if there's any way that we can try to bring some consistency to this process, some consistency in if the project site is going to be open, some consistency in the rules of the road for protecting workers, how to deal with things like inspections, how to deal with subcontractor meetings and job meetings, and how do you deal with concrete trucks driving onto the site to do placements? What are the protocols that should be in place? So we've been meeting as organizations to come up with a set of protocols that go above and beyond what the governor has already put out. And we are working with the Mass Municipal Association and We are making inroads into the state government, and specifically I spoke with the BBRS yesterday, along with the Architectural Registration Board and the Engineering Registration Board, to see if those three boards might get together to have a conversation to talk about issues such as the construction control affidavits that still require you to be on site to do inspections and be responsible for signing off on those prior to an inspector showing up. And the question is, how are we going to handle that? What happens when your construction site is shut down, or what happens when your construction site is moving forward and your employees don't feel comfortable going onto the site because they're noting that people are not social distancing and that workers are congregating on the backs of trucks or congregating around the food truck. So the BBRS has agreed to bring this issue up in, excuse me, at their May meeting. We'll see where the conversation goes, but that is what we've been working on with them. And that's probably the best update I can give you at this point. So with that, I'll stop, and I don't know if there's any questions, but I'll stop if anybody wants to ask any questions or send any of the questions through chat to Andrew or myself.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I haven't seen any questions come in on the chat line for you right now. So far, I've gotten 8 people sending me their AIA numbers. And for anyone that might have come in late, I do encourage you to use the chat box and send something, a little note to me privately with your AIA number to make sure you get credit for continuing education credits. If anyone has questions, please send them over. We'll give it a minute or two, see if anything comes in.
Well, one question did just come in from Eric.
Part of the BRAGB, and they've issued guidance and notices that are in line with the governor's orders. I can share that if you'd like. I kept my guys on site following proper procedures as outlined in their guidelines. Yeah, absolutely. What I've been doing, what we are working with to pass on to MMA and to the BBRS is we've taken the governor's guidelines, and what I've been receiving is guidelines that have been written by both architects and contractors on projects where their construction is still ongoing. And so what I've been doing is taking that, and while there's, as you might imagine, a lot of overlap already between the governor's guidelines and what others are doing in terms of keeping their workers safe, other people have been coming up with other ideas and suggestions, like, for instance, doing pre-shutdown checklists and pre-shutdown contact lists. So in case a worker is found on site to be COVID-19 positive, and there's a need to shut the construction site down because it's turned out that this worker was on site for, say, 2 or 3 days and mixing with other workers, that you may need to shut the site down. So having a process in place to ensure that the site is shut down properly and stays permanently shut down until everybody agrees it's ready to open is probably an important thing. One of the biggest things that I've been telling, and it's right at the front, and I don't know if you'd like, Andrew, I can share my screen and quickly scroll through this guidance just so people can see it. Sure. If you think that would be useful. It can't hurt. Go ahead. Okay, so give me 1 second. I'm going to pull the guidance up, and then I will share my screen. And John, just let me know if I need to make you a co-host or anything in order to do that. I will let you know. I think I just have to share my screen. Okay. Give me 1 second here. Yes. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see that. Yes, perfect. Perfect. So what you can see is, for instance, the biggest thing that we are suggesting people is that, or teams, is probably this statement, which is that what we're putting together is I'm sorry, that's the, apologies, that was not the one I meant. This is the one that I meant. That these guidelines are, as I say in the first sentence, are not intended to replace any formalized procedures that you currently have. But the biggest thing that we've been asking people is that we're considering the project team to be the owner
the general contractor, the design team, and the building officials, meaning both the building commissioners and the fire inspectors. But what we're saying is that regardless of whether these guidelines and procedures meet or exceed the standards that you may already have in place and agreed upon by your project team, the most important thing is that whatever procedures you have in place, that you write them down, that everyone agrees to them, and that you have them, everyone sign them, so that all of the owner, the general contractor, the prime designer and their consultants, and the building officials all sign the document, and that you make it a part of your project record. That way everybody understands the rules of the road for operating on the construction site. And that way, if, for instance, an architectural firm sends someone out to do an on-site inspection and they see issues on site that make them feel uncomfortable or are running counter to the agreed upon processes and procedures for the site, that you can then note that, you can not go to the site, put it in writing why you didn't go to the site, and now you have some basis for everyone in the team to understand why you weren't on the site. Really what we've done is we've taken the governor's guidance, which basically starts right here at the employee health protections, and starts running through what to do about the employees, what to look for in your fellow workers, what the symptoms of COVID-19 are, some of the issues of, and again, this is part of the governor's order that prior to the shift, all employees have to make sure or self-certify that they don't have a fever, that they haven't been in close contact with anyone, and those that are working in these areas have to have their temperature screened. It then goes further into other things like general on-the-job guidance to prevent exposure. No handshaking, for instance. Anyone entering a job site shall be required to undertake mandatory temperature check by the on-site designated medical professional trained individual or COVID-19 officer. The COVID-19 officer is required on all state construction projects. I won't go through all of these, and again, I will send this to Andrew, who can distribute this to everybody. But again, this is just some of the things that are in the governor's, or all of the things that are in the governor's orders, plus some other items that have come out of other general contractors and architects and engineers, MassDOT and others. Again, it gets into work site risk prevention practices. Multi-person activities will be limited where feasible. Large gathering places on the site, such as shacks and break areas, will be eliminated, and instead small break areas will be used for with limited seating. Discussions about wash stations, how to handle job site meetings, subcontractor meetings, dealing with deliveries, how to deal with visitors on the site, looking at things like on-site inspections. This is not intended by any means, because this is just a draft, as you can see with the word draft, that this is just intended to be a beginning. We would love to see this document expanded with best practices from anybody who wants to offer them. And again, this document is not intended to tell you how to do things. It's really just intended as a guideline to say, here are some ideas, and it's really intended to be a starting point, so that when you get your contractor, owner, your consultants, the building officials all together in the room to decide how you want to handle moving forward with construction on your site, that this just provides the basis for the conversation. And other items will come up during these conversations that, again, you should document and make part of your project record. So this is what is being talked about right now. And again, then we get into worker infection protocols, how to deal with identification of exposure, notification of quarantine requirements, sanitation requirements, how to deal with returning to work, and what to do in all cases. So I'll stop sharing that. I'm going to email this to Andrew right now so he can send this out to anybody who is interested in it.
Thank you.
And it looks as though there are some more questions that have come up. So let me.
Yes, Robin was asking about if anyone is talking about the 10th edition 2021 IBC.
No, that has again been pushed to the back burner. The only update that I can give you related to the 2021 IBC, and it's not actually related to the IBC, but more related to the IECC, is that I have noted in the past that AIA Massachusetts has submitted to the Board of Building Regulations and Standards a net zero energy code for inclusion or for consideration for inclusion in the 10th edition of the building code that will come out. And that the net zero energy code that we've submitted is to work in conjunction with the 2021 IECC. And we've submitted it as a option or as an amendment to the current stretch code. And one of the questions that was out there was that the code that we submitted was the exact same code that was submitted to ICC by AIA National to be adopted as an appendix to the 2021 IECC. And when it went through ICC's voting process, it was voted forward. But at the end of the online governmental consensus vote process, there was a challenge to that vote and a few other votes. And the ICC needed to look into that vote to see if there were any irregularities in the vote or if the vote was handled improperly before they could finally certify the vote and promulgate the codes. And that process is finally concluded, and ICC has deemed the vote valid. So the net zero energy proposal that AIA National put forward as an appendix to the 2021 IECC has passed and will actually be promulgated by ICC. And again, that proposal is the exact same proposal that we put forward here in Massachusetts for consideration by the board as they go through the deliberations on the 10th edition of the code. So that's the only update I can give you related to the 10th edition. And again, it's specific to the IECC, not the IBC.
So John, just to piggyback on that, I'm guessing there's not any real updates on it, but the mass plumbing code?
No updates.
Okay.
Nothing. Pretty much, as I've said, everything, unless it's COVID-19 related, pretty much everything is just sort of come to a stop, at least in terms of the regulatory side of the equation, and again on the legislative side of the equation.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, John, can I jump in?
Sure.
Andrew? Okay, so John was talking about protocols and standard procedures for dealing with COVID on the construction sites. I've received several protocols developed by contractors, and I have several coming, and I'm aggregating these to send to ICC because they are, in fact, trying to do a coordinated response, primarily organized around the building officials, but I think the larger community as well. So any of you who have received similar protocols as John was suggesting, we should aggregate these together. So I'm going to forward mine also to John so that people can look through them and find out the commonalities that can possibly be developed into an extended version of what John showed on his screen. I have one example. I don't know if I can bring it up on the screen, Andy.
Are you guys, did I stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, at the moment I'm looking at you.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. I didn't think Drake could share his. I was still sharing mine. And Drake, I did receive what you had sent me before, and actually have incorporated from the documents you sent me into the document I just emailed to you and Drake and Tarika.
I had assumed that would be the case. There is a broader issue that's going to be coming down, and that's what do we do to reopen? And the CDC has developed, I wouldn't call it a checklist, but more like a keep this in mind sort of document. And let me see if I can find that here. Just had it, there we go. If I can bring it up on screen, Andy, can I have control?
You are listed as a co-host. I don't know why you wouldn't be able to just go to share screen.
Okay.
You should have administrative controls.
Thank you.
There we go.
Okay, so this is one of the documents that as I was going through the internet last week, that if you can't find it, let me know, and I can share with you. I've got several other documents which are of interest. So as you can see, this is something by the American Industrial Health Association, and it's focused on recovering building closures. And you can see there's some of the things that all of us would be quite concerned about if we walked into a building. I doubt from COVID-19 that it's going to look that way, but in terms of getting buildings cleaned up and ready for actual use without recontaminating people, this kind of document is going to need to be integrated into a broader spectrum of guidelines that we can all then use. I think that what John has got access to for us is various leaders around the state. Somewhere along the line, this all has to be rolled into the reopening. And as you can see, there's a bunch of people who are highly qualified to address issues like this. And so the question then comes, how much of this is going to become an issue for either the regulators, Department of Health at the state level, or the local officials? And there's just a lot of work yet to be done. And I'm really glad that John's going to be, John's going to be front and center on that stuff. And I think we can all be supporting of that. So if you see any documents, let's see, here it is. So this is similar. This is one of the items I sent John, and I think you would see some of the similarities in the issues covered. I've gotten a bunch of others. Some of them are. One of them is a 31-page document, and it included things like signage, location, a site plan that shows location of hand washing and other basically cleanup processes, construction control locations where you get in and out and that kind of thing. So the amount of protocols, information that might be distilled into a master document is, there's a lot out there. And as I said, please, if you get such a document, get approval from the contractor to share it with us. And I think, let's see, there was, Eric had just sent a site for one of their processes. That seems to have disappeared from the chat, but anyhow, so I'll share this stuff with anybody that is interested in it, and I'd like to just continue to aggregate it. So anyhow, I'll cut off at that point. Let me just see, there was one other. Yeah, so with that, I'll turn it over to Andy and Tarika, and I'll see the screen back to them. Andy, take it away.
Thanks, Drake. All right, just to keep everybody in the loop, right now we're up to 25 of you have sent me your AIA numbers. If anyone else hasn't, please send them over, and I will make sure that BSA coordinates getting you credit for this. I'm not seeing any other questions for John coming up. I would say if there are further questions, since we are pretty much around that cutoff point, send them to us privately and we will coordinate with John to try to get answers. Additionally, I did want to let you know that I have been talking with AIA National. Just like the BSA, they're constantly uploading new information on the main website related to the COVID-19 and what response we can take as a community. One thing, even the National Codes and Standards Committee doesn't have a whole lot going on right now. They're largely redirecting people over to things like the Disaster Assistance Committee. Anyone that's interested, especially small businesses, AIAU currently has a free course to everybody about business continuity planning. One of those things that a lot of small firms don't have time to take care of. And while it's not entirely geared toward pandemics, it does touch on that information, so it might be of interest. As additional information comes out, we'll try to make that available to you.
Hey, Andrew?
Yeah.
One other small item that, if I could just put it out there.
Sure.
It's more of an issue that we've heard a few examples of, which for what I'm about to describe for design professionals obviously will be a bit of an issue. But what I'd like to put out there and ask anybody, if you find yourself in this situation, to let us know. Not that we can necessarily help with what I'm about to describe, but we're just trying to document when this is occurring. We're starting to hear examples of instances where on construction sites that are remaining open, that owners have been requesting of the prime design construction professional, they've been asking for them to certify that the guidelines and procedures, like the example that I've shown, that the guidelines and procedures for the way construction sites are supposed to be operated these days, they're asking us to certify that that is actually happening on on their particular job. As you might imagine, every design professional out there should be pushing back hard against that and saying, no, they won't do that. We are not in control of contractors' means and methods, nor should we be. But owners have been looking for some sort of assurance, and they're turning to their design professionals to try to certify that. Again, we don't have any, I'm not here to give legal advice. The only advice that I would give you is that if you find yourself in that instance, to get a hold of your attorney as quickly as possible to talk to them about that, because your immediate response probably should be no, because that's not part of your contract to do something like that. But we're trying to collect instances where that has happened, because we are starting to hear of that happening. And we would like to obviously try to thwart that as much as possible. So having knowledge of where it might be occurring, we don't need your construction project itself. If you just want to tell us that it's happening to you, and even if you're willing to tell us what town or what municipality it's happening in, we would greatly appreciate that, because we'd like to work with the contractors and the owners and others to ensure that we're making sure that the sites are safe, but we need to do it in ways that are not putting further legal liability on either design professionals or contractors or anyone else. So with that, thank you.
Thanks, John. I hadn't heard about that. That's good to know.
I don't know about all of you, but all of our projects in Massachusetts have shut down. We do have some projects in Florida that are still open. I'm trying to find out what's going on relative to controlling those sites for infection, but I haven't gotten any information there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if no one else has any questions, I guess we'll say thank you to John, and we'll touch base with you hopefully next month.
Yep.
Assuming we've got something to talk about. Tarika, would you like to introduce our speaker for the day?
Absolutely. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with Vernon Woodworth from various sustainability or prior codes committee, event service, advocacy. He provided a very modest introduction. So I will go ahead and read that, and then we will let him get started with our topic for today with the 2021 IECC and the Net Zero Energy Code. So Vernon Woodworth is a service leader for life safety and codes at Fitzemeyer and Tocci Incorporated and a member of the faculty at the Boston Architectural College. So Vernon, take it away.
Thank you. Welcome everybody. I'm going to share my screen and get started.
Again, everybody, just as we get started, please send your comments into the Zoom chat, and then we will politely try to interrupt Vernon as he goes along to try to get to your answers. This way we're not overwhelming the audio.
So I managed to press the wrong button, but I'm going to try again here. All right. Hang in there. So this presentation is going to discuss the current movement at the American Institute of Architects to redirect the profession. And I just have to get back to the right screen. And a big part of that is making architects more responsible for code compliance. You might think that we're already fully responsible, but in fact, they want to go beyond our current relationship to the building departments and permitting process and make architects the arbiters of code compliance as opposed to simply the stewards of the drawings and construction administration. So for whatever reason, I can't get onto the screen. I'm just going to briefly disconnect and try to start over.
Okay.
So I'll be right back.
All right. Hold on, everybody. We'll be back in a minute.
Oh, okay, that worked. All right, let's try again. Now, I don't know whether you're seeing me or the screen at this point.
We're seeing PowerPoint. I mean, it looks like it would be on your computer, but if you just hit from beginning in the top left, it should make it full screen.
You got it. All right. Great. Okay. So ZCREA, the Zero Code Renewable Energy Appendix, is what John Unnery was referring to earlier. This is the name that the AIA has given this document. It has, and I would say rather remarkably, managed to make its way through the International Code Council code development process, which in the past has been a hurdle for anything of major significance. The purpose, of course, is to require renewable energy systems of adequate capacity to achieve zero net carbon. Applies only to new buildings and is not applicable to single-family houses, multifamily structures of 3 stories or fewer above grade in height. It is also not applicable to manufactured homes or manufactured houses. And it exempts buildings that use neither electricity nor fossil fuel. The code is built around this idea of a zero energy performance index, or ZEPI. And I have a slide later in the presentation that illustrates what ZEPI is, but it's an outgrowth of the concept of energy use intensity, which is, so ZEPI is the ratio of proposed building EUI without renewables to the baseline building EUI expressed as a percentage. I'm going to back up to last year when the IPCC released their interim report concluding that limited global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade will require rapid and far-reaching transitions in land, energy, industry, buildings, transportation, and cities. And global CO2 emissions must fall, according to this report, by 45% from 2010 levels by 2030, reaching net zero by 2050. Because buildings account for about 40% of the energy used in the US and over 1/3 of carbon emissions, this is a priority. Whether it was a direct reaction to the report or just a coincidental manifestation, the school strike movement and the prominence of younger people making an effort to bring the issues of climate change to the wider world in a new way defined 2019. And at the forefront of the building code effort is Ed Masria and his group, the 2030 Initiative. The urban built environment is responsible for 75% of annual global GHG emissions, and buildings alone count for, in this case, 39%. Eliminating these emissions is the key to addressing climate change and meeting Paris Climate Agreement targets. So Architecture 2030 issued a 2030 challenge. All new buildings, developments, and major renovations shall be carbon neutral by 2030. You saw on the previous slide, Ed conferring with his brain trust there, Mike Davis. To accomplish this, Architecture 2030 issued the 2030 Challenge in 2006, asking the global architecture and building community to adopt the following targets: new buildings, developments, and major renovations designed to meet a fossil fuel GHG emitting energy consumption performance standard of 70% below the regional or country average median for that building type. And at a minimum, an equal amount of existing building areas shall be renovated annually to meet a fossil fuel GHG emitting energy consumption performance standard of 70% of the regional or county average median for that building type. The Architecture 2030 plan or challenge set out the following target dates. The fossil fuel reduction standards for all new buildings and major renovation shall be increased to 80% in 2020. We didn't make it. 90% by 2025. And be carbon neutral in 2030 using no fossil fuel GHG emitting energy to operate. And the intent is that these targets would be met by implementing innovative, sustainable design strategies, generating on-site renewable energy, and or purchasing at a maximum of 20% off-site renewable energy. Now, also last year at convention, the AIA passed a resolution for urgent and sustained climate action. It includes the following: AIA to declare an urgent climate imperative for carbon reduction, AIA to transform the day-to-day practice of architects to achieve a zero carbon, equitable, resilient, and healthy built environment, and AIA to leverage support of our peers, clients, policymakers, and the public at large. The initial focus being on designing for economy, energy, and equitable communities, which is an update of the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit, familiar from around 2000. A framework for design excellence will guide all strategic planning efforts based on the COTE Top 10 measures. If you're familiar with the annual COTE Top 10 awards, there are 10 measures of sustainability applied to each project in determining which should be granted awards. Apparently this requirement or this idea of making a framework for design excellence is now going to guide all awards granted by the AIA. So in the broadest possible terms, these are the goals of AIA's big move. Generate data regarding the built environment. Publicly distribute building performance data, including energy, water, and air quality. They want to redefine health, safety, and welfare in what they're calling a holistic manner to include resilience, equitable design, and advanced building performance. And they want architects to collectively take responsibility as a profession for code compliance, and are working to enable a transition to outcome-based building codes and standards, and implement comprehensive peer review and third-party commissioning. There's an assumption that well, it's more than an assumption. There's been a study determining that the profession of the building official is in jeopardy due to reduced numbers and an inability to attract new building officials. And building on that, the AIA is asking that the architectural profession essentially step into the breach and self-certify and or institute peer review processes that will substitute for the plan review process of the building's official. So, and simultaneously, as John mentioned, the ICC code amendment hearings introduced a zero code renewable energy appendix that was approved as a voluntary element of the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code. As an appendix, it would have to be separately adopted by the jurisdiction. The reasoning given by the ICC is that the large number of communities that have pledged to maintain and meet the goals of the Paris Accord is significant, and this appendix is intended to support that effort. So it requires new commercial, institutional, and mid to high-rise residential buildings install or procure enough renewable energy to achieve zero net carbon annually. Does not include existing buildings. That was in the 2030 challenge. The appendix encourages on-site renewable energy systems when feasible, but also supports off-site procurement of renewable energy. That was 20% maximum in Ed Masria's format. There's no maximum imposed by the Iecc. And it does not allow renewable energy to be traded off against the energy efficiency required by the base energy code. So you're still asked to fully comply with all of the conservation measures for energy reduction, and then make up the gap with your on-site or off-site renewables. The provisions contained in this appendix are mandatory and specified as such in the jurisdictions adopting ordinance. Now, just like with previous energy codes, there are several compliance paths, prescriptive path of the 2021 IECC and the performance approach are based on the same principles as previously. Prescriptive means simply you apply the values from tables to the various aspects of a building's design, whether it's envelope or systems. Whereas performance approach requires computer modeling, excuse me, a base building energy usage and the modeling of a design to determine its conservation below base building consumption. When the prescriptive approach is used, the renewable energy that must be installed or procured is specified based on building type and climate zone. I haven't dug into this table yet, but it's going to be key to meeting the Iecc. For instance, an office building in climate zone 3A would need renewable energy production of 29,000 BTUs per square foot per year. And that comes from the table. When the performance approach is used, the renewable energy requirement is based on energy modeling, and the needed renewable energy can be reduced through energy efficiency measures that exceed code. So it's not relying on renewables. The Iecc allows the design professional and building owner to choose the path that best fits the climate zone, project needs, design goals, and aspirations of the community. The building officials are only asked to identify the compliance path selected, to verify that the appropriate information is in the design package for the building permit application, and to inspect during construction to confirm that the design features have been installed. So there's a fairly self-explanatory diagram, and you can see that the ultimate decision-making of on-site renewable energy and off-site renewable energy is the same, regardless of which path you choose. This illustration perhaps is a little more helpful, showing the steps of designing an energy efficient building in minimum compliance with the IECC 2021 or better, establishing the renewable energy requirements from an energy simulation or default renewable energy table. And I think that's the table that was shown on the previous slide or referenced. And meeting the requirement by integrating on-site renewable energy when feasible. Of course, if you have a high-rise building, and this appears to illustrate one, your ratio of surface area for solar voltaic will be unable to achieve net zero. So in this case, it may be necessary to procure off-site renewable energy. So a little more on the prescriptive path. Again, the AX 104 references the table which determines the renewable energy requirement. We have the square footage of the building. We have the goal for annual energy use from the table. And we have the total energy use. That's, of course, the goal is in square foot breakdown, and you have to multiply it by the number of square feet. So that's how we get up to 1.45 million kBTUs per year. And from that, determine the megawatts required per hour, per year. And if you use the performance-based approach, the team models the building to take advantage of more efficient lighting loads, smartly sized and oriented windows, external shading, and advanced HVAC systems. Compliance with the energy efficiency requirements of the IECC is achieved according to the energy performance modeling rules referenced in section C401.2 of the IECC. With the more energy efficient building, a considerably smaller PV system can be installed to meet the requirements, and in most cases, it will be more cost effective to increase the energy efficiency and reduce the size of the renewable energy systems.
Vernon, we have a question popped up.
Okay.
Eric is asking, I was wondering if a better metric to limit the size and scope of a project is to set an energy budget instead of height and size restrictions. The bigger the energy budget your site can make, the bigger the building you can make. In other words, the more energy you can make on site sets the limits to the building size based on how well the building is designed.
Yeah, and I don't pretend to be an expert on these things. It's an interesting idea, but I think the main thrust of this presentation is that you want to make your building as efficient as possible, and then only then rely on the renewables. So if you're going to allow greater energy usage based on availability of renewable technologies, that may be self-defeating. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but that's how I understood it. If an owner does not want to install any on-site renewable energy, they can only sign a contract to purchase renewable energy credits for a period of 15 years. Evidence or a copy of this contract must be provided to the code official with the permit application and filed with the other construction documents. And this is another area. So 15 years may seem like a long time, but what are the implications for the building beyond those 15 years? Now, all of a sudden, we have a building with a life expectancy of another 35 years or more, which is going to be performing, well, it's going to be emitting greenhouse gases.
Vernon, we have another question. This one is from Greta Eckhart. She's asking, who is studying what amount of renewable energy will be needed for the projects that can achieve net zero energy on site? Who will provide it? How much land it will use and how it will be regulated? How will forest and agricultural land be protected from companies that see this as an opportunity for profit? I think it's important to make energy conservation within the building mandatory, and allowing only a maximum of 20% off-site renewables is a good step in this direction. But we really need a holistic approach to the entire carbon cycle that recognizes the contribution of plants, soil carbon to the balance of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere.
I agree completely. The International Code Council might have an issue with extending their jurisdiction to that extent, but the profession clearly has to. The 20% limit on renewables does not appear in this appendix. I don't know what to say about the potential. Well, I think it's actually probably fairly unrealistic to go too much beyond 20%. If we look at the net zero buildings that are out there, it'd be interesting to know what percentage of their energy is from renewables. And I'd be surprised if too many are much over 20%. But I really think that what the code is trying to encourage, even though they don't set a limit, is minimizing well below 20%. And yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if this will contribute in any way. Greta was initially asking who is studying what amount of renewable energy is needed, and then Lenardi Array just asked how was the 29 kilobTUs per square foot per year determined? Perhaps it was explained and he missed it. Are these numbers, basically who is coming up with these figures that were integrated into this appendix? Was this Ed Mazaria's group?
No, I don't think Ed had direct influence on this amendment. I think that the New Buildings Institute was instrumental, and I think there was probably other work done. Let's look at this slide again. The table AICC 104.1 is where we came up with the 29 kBTUs per square foot per year. And that is the limit established by the code. So this is probably considerably below what, for instance, CBEX, that Commercial Building Energy Consumption Survey, would assign to a given building type. Again, the climate zone is important, the building type is important, and we don't necessarily know what building this is or where it is. We do have palm trees in the back end, so I guess that's a hint. But the 29 kBTUs can be assumed to be a significant reduction in standard energy usage over a previously code compliant building. It may even be below what the 2021 would allow without application of the appendix.
So is it safe to say that at least as a simple answer to who is coming up with these figures, how are those tables coming together, this is really something that a code action committee or someone involved in the ICC code development process is directly involved with, where these numbers originated? We might have to do more research to outreach to them to get that kind of information?
Yes, and the way that the process works is that an independent group, industry, environmental, nonprofit, will create a code amendment proposal, which will be reviewed by a subcommittee and then potentially brought to the floor during ICC's annual meeting. And now they do electronic voting. It was the electronic voting that got this amendment passed, largely because of activity of environmental groups here in Massachusetts. It made a big difference to have advocates contacting building officials and getting them to vote. But the actual technical information would have originated with the authors of the amendment, and I can't say for sure who that is. Perhaps John knows, but I'm probably safe in guessing that the New Buildings Institute they've made this a priority. They've been around for several decades and have increasingly been effective in the arena of code.
Vernon, John's added a little bit that might help us here. He believes that all of the details for the proposal came directly from Ed Masria's group, and then the actual code proposal was written by Dave Collins from the preview group.
All right, my apologies to Ed for not knowing that. That's great news. And of course, I've been studying this for 20 years or more. This approach has been fully endorsed by the AIA, and so the initiative is a direct outcome of his. And I know that he's keeping track of the projects that are getting certified under the 2030 initiative. So he's aware of the numbers of square feet being constructed according to the guidelines of that initiative around the world. And as I understand it, it's becoming increasingly optimistic and actually has he thinks we can reach net zero. So he's now aiming for 2040 as opposed to his previous 2050 guideline. But I think as far as the question of the extent of renewables, I would be surprised if he hasn't studied that fairly carefully and has some basis for his. It's surprising then if he developed these that the 20% limit isn't in the appendix, but who knows? Backroom dealing. So the Zachary amendment has been submitted, and the idea of making the stretch code a zero code renewable energy appendix would be quite astonishing. It would be, I think, having followed this process now for 20 years, it would be a banner moment in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Of course, the stretch code is the most successful public policy endeavor in my memory with regard to sustainability, in large part because it relies on incentives as opposed to mandatory requirements. And it was watered down in the 9th edition. The consolation there is that all of the requirements of the stretch code under the 8th edition were submitted and adopted by the International Energy Conservation Code 2015, which means that the Massachusetts stretch code became the base code throughout the country. And with the 2021, we could, again, take a bold step that would likely be an example to others. One thing I do want to point out, the energy code is rewritten every 3 years, so there will be an IECC in 2014. What am I trying to say? 2024. And the base code of requirements for conservation are very likely to be more rigorous in that code. And So I think I can imagine that the intent here is to bring the base code into alignment with the Iecc, and then the appendix can be eliminated because the base energy code will require zero greenhouse gas emissions and zero carbon. But getting back to the stretch code, it would be mandatory in all designated green communities, and it could still be adopted by other communities in the Commonwealth. So it's been alleged or claimed that an existing office building retrofitted to zero energy with renewables can produce a return on investment in as little as 5 to 6 years, given today's incentive structure. And that's quite brief. Building energy demand can be reduced 44 to 54% across all building types with technology that is readily available today. Again, it has the same exception: single-family homes, multifamily structures, 3 stories or fewer, mobile and modular homes, and buildings that don't use energy. So here is the stretch code adoption map from September of last year. And I know there's a more recent map out there that shows even more adoptions. But I think this is astonishing and overwhelming.
Vernon?
Yes.
We just have a comment from Eric Dardal. He's saying that he believes the real issue is the current energy grid and not the building industry. While I also believe we should build better buildings that perform better, it's simply a Band-Aid on a hemorrhaging wound. I think it would be a lot quicker and cheaper to transition the entire grid to safe nuclear technology than to make every building, both residential and commercial, net zero. He says he's a certified passive house builder, and he does subscribe to net zero notions, but I think we'll miss the mark if we only focus on the buildings. And I think that's an important thing to address, but in the bigger picture, it's extremely important that we focus on trying to achieve something that is important, but not striving for absolute perfection on day one that may end up pulling us away from getting adoption across the country, and it makes it just a Massachusetts related thing. John and I have talked about this, and again, you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, is the expression he uses. So I just wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So of course the energy code does not regulate the grid, but I do know that the IECC, ASHRAE, and the New Buildings Institute are all looking at issues related to peak demand, energy, well, what's it called? Demand response technologies. And I think there is language to that effect in the base 2021 IECC. So if we can shave the peak, flatten the curve, to borrow an analogy, we can potentially reduce demand on the grid. The regulation of the grid is well beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. And so I'm not disagreeing. I just don't think that any action by the International Code Council or the BBRS could assist with that. So I just want to dwell a little bit on the stretch code because it's such a shining example. The clear experience, demonstrable outcome is that when a community adopted or became a green community, it increased real estate prices, it shortened time on the market, and surrounding communities followed suit. I don't think there's too, and building permits increased. So I don't think there's too many other metrics for defining success for a public policy. That pretty much is a home run as far as I'm concerned. So I think adopting the Iecc as the basis of the stretch code will give us all a tremendous amount of hope and make Massachusetts continue to be a leader in this area. All right, so here's the Zippy diagram. And the advantage of this is in showing the relationship of the previous codes, a base of the CBEX 23 average performance on a linear path to zero net energy. So for many years, the only way we had of describing our advancement towards the goal of zero net energy was saying, you know, well, we're 10% more energy efficient than the previous edition of the code. But there was no baseline, so that could potentially continue indefinitely. By establishing a starting point at CBEX 2003 and an end point at zero net energy, and then placing the various initiative goals, codes, standards on a linear line along that path, we get a clear idea of where we stand. And although the 2021 IECC isn't on here currently, I think we're down around the Architecture 2030 goal for 2015. I don't think we're to 2020 yet. But this is ZEPI, and everybody should have that acronym rolling off their tongues. Zero Energy Performance Index. Now, I want to just describe briefly another proposal that's being submitted to the BBRS, and this was prepared by the Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership with others to develop a proposal to update the existing stretch energy code. And it is also a zero code appendix with some variations on the AIA approach. The intent is to focus on load reduction on energy efficiency and electrification, but also renewable energy. So the differences are the extent of the emphasis on the energy conservation measures. And you can see those here, all of which we're familiar with. It's just perhaps a slightly tighter approach. So the Iecc relies on the prescriptive requirements of the 2021 IECC, whereas MASEC, as we're calling it, the Mass Zero Energy Code, or in some cases the EASY Code, makes the prescriptive measures more efficient. The intent is to offer a prescriptive compliance path offering a more straightforward approach to building energy performance, a backstop for projects using the performance energy model path to avoid the variability that can come from relying solely on energy modeling, and requirements that preclude on-site combustion. So the elimination of natural gas in new construction, with exceptions, to ensure that buildings can rely on renewable electricity, a pass-fail criteria for renewable energy sources, and the rules avoid the weighting factors from the AIA Zero Code, while weighting as in, not weighting for Godot, but weighting in terms of weight, ensuring that the source of renewable energy provides additionality. And it adds requirements to address the critical issue of resilience and demand management. So that's our overview. And there's Ed again with his brain trust at the BSA, saving the world. Happy to engage in conversation, answer questions, and figure out where we go from here. I need to end.
Okay, let's open up the chat. Now that Vernon's not sharing his screen, he might be able to see these as they come up along with the rest of us. Or somebody wants to talk, just send me a message, let me know, and I can unmute you. Can we get a copy of the presentation? Yeah, okay. One person's asking me privately if it's possible to get a copy of this presentation. Vernon, would you have any objections
None at all.
to sharing this?
I'd be happy to.
Excellent.
Can we have the BSA distributed or provide a link?
Ideally, yes. There is a resources page associated with the BSA Codes Committee. We've had some challenges in the past with getting things loaded up to it since the website transitioned into the current format. Again, we'll try to get it uploaded there. If we have to send it out directly to members, then we'll do that too.
Okay.
Okay, Anita Simon is asking, please remind us where MA is in this effort related to other states.
This effort to achieve.
I'm going to say to getting us to net zero energy codes or appendices.
I'm going to guess that we're ahead of the curve in terms of submitting a proposal for.
If Massachusetts were to, I spoke with Ed Mazzari a couple of weeks ago, and if we were to do it, we would be the first state to not only implement it, but implement it alongside the implementation of the 2021 Iecc and the 2021 IBC, because it's being considered as part of the 10th edition code proposal process. So it would make Massachusetts unique in the sense of we would be the first state to actually be in a line with ICC's code cycle, and we would also be the first state to actually adopt it statewide, the net zero energy proposal that is. There's a lot of ifs in that statement though.
Right, this has to get approved by the Board of Building Regulations and Standards. And I think, John, you told me that they want to form a subcommittee to study the idea. And obviously,
so what they've done to this point is they have taken our proposal and sent it down to their Energy Advisory Committee, which has met a couple of times and has reviewed the proposal. And I would say at this point, I mean, the Energy Advisory Committee has not taken a vote on this yet, but at least in the conversations they've had over the first two meetings, they seem inclined to recommend to the BBRS, to the full board, which is actually in control of it, to say, yes, this is something we should do. Again, we have to start from the basis that the board itself, the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, has said they want a net zero energy provision to be included in the 10th edition of the code, but they didn't specify, because they don't have the ability to at this point, they didn't specify what that actually means or what it would look like, which is why we submitted this proposal and why NEEP and others are trying to build upon our proposal by taking what will become a national proposal and modifying it to become a Massachusetts specific proposal. So what the Energy Advisory Committee will have to do is look at both proposals. They will likely review it and make the recommendation to the board that both proposals are perfectly good, but simply note that one proposal is in line with a national code unamended, and one would be amended to be Massachusetts specific. And it will be up to the BBRS to decide whether they are interested in making net zero energy provisions that are Massachusetts specific or not. And I don't have a feel one way or another at this point for where the board might fall on something like that. Does that help? Did you guys hear that?
Yep.
Yep.
And yes, Darren is absolutely right. DC will adopt it, but we're talking about New York State. Sorry, we're talking about it as a statewide code, not as a municipal code, which is essentially what DC is. DC is still part of Maryland.
So Vernon, just a side note question. We saw the map that I think all of us are familiar with the stretch code adoption in Massachusetts. And every time you see that map, it gets more and more populated. At what point do we suspend use of that map and just say every community is adopting this?
Well, I think the great value of the Green Communities Act is that it is voluntary. So, but because of the fact that our initial stretch code became the base code, that in fact happened, not just in Massachusetts, but around the country. So I don't think we ever have to do that. I think that somehow we found a way to create a testing ground for a policy that allows voluntary adoption of greater energy efficiency and sustainability.
Okay. All right, it's only about 9:30. We've still got another half hour if anyone has additional questions. Wouldn't be the first time we've ended a meeting a little early, and that's okay too. But again, if anybody has questions, please let us know that you want to contribute. Right now, I'm up to 34 AIA numbers for today's meeting. We'll make sure you get continuing ed credits for those. We'll try to make sure we get numbers for anybody else. Yeah, does anyone else want to add? Why the single family and multifamily less than 3 stories or fewer are exempt from the appendix?
John, do you know if that was Dave Collins's idea or whether that was the way it was written initially?
So as I understand it, what has been submitted to ICC, there is both the code that Vernon presented and a residential component or a separate residential component that is also passed. That being said, in Massachusetts, we chose not to pursue the residential side of the equation simply because of Massachusetts politics. We know, or I know at least, in the 20 years of dealing with the BBRS and dealing with legislative and regulatory issues, that right now a proposal to require net zero energy on new home construction will not fly. It will be heavily opposed by other organizations. So that being said, we chose the option to say, let's work it on the commercial side of the equation first, because the commercial side of the equation is a smaller subset of buildings in the overall count of buildings in Massachusetts. And we're taking the approach that we took with the original stretch energy code, which is where the concern at that point was that there was going to be massive confusion in the communities that adopted it and didn't adopt it. And we heard lots of cries that the sky was going to fall and it was going to be a regulatory nightmare. We proved that that simply wasn't the case. And we started on the commercial side of the equation. And so we intend to do the same thing here. Start on the commercial side of the equation, show that it actually can be done, it can be accomplished. Obviously, there will be some costs involved in this. I know that there are studies out there that say there are no costs to going to net zero. I disagree with that. I think anybody who's ever worked in design and construction and designed a building and built a building knows that there will be some cost involved in this, although the costs are likely to be very small. But we want to show that it can work, that it does work. And once it's proven to work, then we can have the conversation about extending this to the residential side of the equation. We also know the politics of the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, and quite frankly, they are not going to pass a net zero energy code that requires home construction to be net zero energy, at least for the 10th edition. It won't happen. Some of it on AIA MA's side of the equation when we submitted this was literally just reading political tea leaves and trying to put forward a proposal that we feel the board will actually adopt, which is why we went with a code that is a national code. We did not make any proposed amendments to it because we know that the Board of Building Regulations and Standards has for 20 years said, we don't want to make our codes Massachusetts specific. We want to adopt what comes out of ICC wholesale as much as possible, obviously to amend our code, like Chapter 1, for instance. But we chose a path that said, let's adopt the national standard. So at least we have something in place, and then we can build upon that. And that is what the Board of AIA Massachusetts has decided. And that is the path that I've been following when I push this with the Board of Building Regulations and Standards. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
So we have some people, Kylie Moore is asking, where can we find the table that had the 29 EUI for the office building? She'd like to see what the school baseline is, for example.
Yeah, we should probably circulate that along with the presentation. That's actually in the...
I can probably bring it up. And then I can send everybody the, excuse me, the national AIA, the proposal that national put forward to ICC for consideration. I will bring it up on my screen in a second here, so people can see it, which will get to the table that Vernon is mentioning. Just give me a second to find it.
Thanks, John. I went looking and couldn't find it in my records.
Give me 1 second. Yes, so bear with me, I have it. So let me share my screen, get to that. Okay, so this should be able to allow everybody to, can everybody see that at this point?
Yes.
And so so there is the formula for determining minimum renewable energy. Here's the table per climate zone. So somebody was asking about schools. Honestly, I don't, what do we, climate zone 5? I forget honestly which.
5A, I think.
5A, so probably 39. But again, I will send this to, I will forward this to Andrew and Terica and Drake, and you guys can take a look at it. Again, this is the national, this is what ICC will be promulgating as an appendix to the 2021 IECC. And again, to be clear, word for word, this is what we've submitted here in Massachusetts. We've just included it in the Stretch Energy Code as a section within the Stretch Energy Code. There's the adjusted offsite renewable energy. That's the formula that gets used. And here's the table that's associated with that. Some other items.
All right, so John, when we send out the Vernon's presentation, we'll try to either get this loaded onto the BSA resources page, or we'll send it along with that so that members can take a look. I received one question privately, and Vernon, John, if either of you disagree, please let me know. To what extent does the code permit alternative, innovative, renewable energy systems that may be specific to specific sites? Is that considered in the prescriptive standards? My read on that would be that you would follow an alternative compliance path, just like you would for anything else that's not directly addressed in the building code. It's not to say you couldn't be approved to do something like that, but you may need a secondary approval from the BBRS.
I believe the appendix lists the opportunities for renewables. And so if it's not on the list, then I agree, you'd probably have to pursue a compliance alternative or alternative approach.
We also have another question. Any ideas the exempt part would be what percentage of all residential units in Massachusetts?
I couldn't tell you what percentage that would be. It's just it exempts all 1 and 2 family construction.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we can.
That I don't know what number that would actually be. I mean, what we do know is there's a massive shortage of housing in this state, so it wouldn't affect any of the 435,000 units that were short in the state.
Yeah.
So this wouldn't have an effect on that, unless, of course, those apartments are all built in mid-rise or high-rise construction, then it would.
And Lenardia Ray expands on that, asking, would considering the inclusion of 2-family and 3-family condominiums make sense, since those are somewhat commercial projects? I would say it depends on who you talk to. I'm starting work with a HUD committee in developing residential resiliency guidelines. And from my experience already, trying to get a room of 60 people to agree on what defines residential when you've got a mix of architects, engineers, real estate developers, home builders, and government officials. To some of us, that answer is 1- and 2-family construction. Some say that should expand to townhouses. Some say to up to 4 stories, and some will say everything that somebody can physically live in. So I think in the long run, yes, we should strive to get to the point where everybody's being included in that concept. For now, we can focus on the ones that we can actually get past, so that some progress is made and demonstrates capacity and feasibility for achieving the other ones.
Again, I fall back on something Andy said earlier that I've said in the past, which is we shouldn't let perfect be the enemy of good. There are a million things that we could probably add to the base proposal that AIA National has put forward. My only concern about that is the more proposals that get put forward, the more things that the BBRS has to consider, the longer it's going to take us to actually get something in place working here in Massachusetts. And again, what I go back to is the comments that the BBRS has made time and again, which is they really do not want to make Massachusetts specific amendments. What they would prefer to do is take all of the ideas that are looking to make the code, the national code, better, and take those proposals and send them to ICC. And if they can survive the ICC process, which is architects, engineers, building officials, fire officials, contractors, and others, a much larger version of the BBRS process, if the proposal can survive that process, then it can become a national standard. Rather than making it a Massachusetts specific standard, because the concern about making it Massachusetts specific has always been an economic development argument that when companies look to come to Massachusetts and they look at our regulatory structure, if they see that we are requiring construction processes and practices that are well above and beyond any other state, they may go to another state. And that, with a Republican administration, carries a lot of weight and a lot of water. And right now we have a Republican administration in Massachusetts. So we, again, have looked at the political tea leaves, and that is part of the reason why we've submitted a proposal that it literally mirrors the national proposal. That's not to say that my board or that AIA doesn't believe that the proposal could be stronger. It's just what we would like to see is something actually implemented, and we'd like to see it implemented sooner rather than later. And if we try to make more and more and more amendments to this, it's going to be later and later and later. Most of you have watched the code process. You know that it takes years to get codes adopted here in the state. So the concern is making sure we don't needlessly slow that process down.
But John, you had mentioned that IECC 2021 will have a residential zero code appendix, but I completely agree with your argument about the politics. The reason we have a watered down stretch code in the 9th edition is due to the input of the home builders and others. And 2021 will be adopted under the same governor who allowed that to occur. So yeah, it's just not a political reality. And I think not just the percentage of buildings, but also the extent of energy used by the residential sector is a relevant statistic here.
Yeah, I agree. And it's, I keep coming back to a simple saying: we don't want to let perfect be the enemy of good. The proposal that the national organization, ICC, that all 50 states in some form adopt those codes. They have a national process, which is a much more inclusive process than the BBRS's process ever possibly could be. And since that process is there, and it did survive that process, I don't see why Massachusetts shouldn't rely on that, or any other state for that matter. And once it's in place, then we build upon it, because it's there. And Massachusetts certainly has been a leader in energy efficiency. And what I would argue is that a lot of the proposals that are out there that have been talked about are looking more to change base energy code requirements than the specific net zero energy code requirement. Because the net zero energy code, when you really think about it, all it's basically doing is telling you, and Vernon had that slide that shows it, which is designed to whatever standard applies in your state as it relates to the 2021 IECC, which will have stretch energy code provisions applied to it. You design your building to that standard. You run a formula that basically tells you how much energy you need to produce for that particular building. And then you design solar panel systems to offset that number. And if you can't achieve it on site, then you do it through a combination of on-site or on-site, off-site, or both. So the idea of tightening our building and making it a more energy efficient building, it seems to me that's where our efforts really should be on the amendment side here in Massachusetts, if we're going to pursue that, to try to make the 2021 base IECC stronger, because I'm not sure that it matters that much around on the net zero energy side of the equation, on the appendix side of the equation, because the appendix side of the equation is just saying that you're going to offset whatever amount of energy your building is producing through renewable systems. So I would make that argument. Others may not agree with that, I'm sure, but that's the argument that I would put forward, and I think that's the argument that the Board of AIA Massachusetts is sort of standing behind. Silenced everybody with that one.
Pretty much. All right, at this point, I think we've technically touched on everybody's questions that have been presented. Vernon, thank you for presenting today under these unique circumstances. I know this is a little challenging without having a live audience to feed off of.
Well, we've got a larger audience as a result.
We do. So that's the trade-off, is I think you're the highest attendance we've had at a presentation in a good while. John, thank you for joining us as well with some updates and helping out there. All right, I'm not sure if Tarek is still on the line. We are going to try to have a meeting set up for next month. Pay attention to the BSA email and calendar. Our original speaker, we've pushed over to May, so sorry, to June. So we're going to see who we get set up for next month, but stay posted and we'll do our best. Thank you, everyone. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye-bye. Okay. Good. This is good.